over to you.
Great. So can everyone see the slides okay?
Yes, looking good.
Okay. So, so I lead the Watercourses Team at Enfield Council and have done for over 10 years now. Just to give you, before I kick off and explain more about the Beaver project, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to Enfield and the context where we sit, so you understand why we wanted to do the project in the first place. Now, Enfield is in London, but it's only just about in London. As you can see from the dark outlined area there, Enfield is the northernmost London borough. And what that image is also showing is the catchment of the River Lee. So you can see where Enfield sits. We're very much in the lower Lee, or the London Lee, sometimes it's referred to. The River Lee is the eastern boundary of Enfield, but actually what we've got is a lot of main river tributaries, Turkey Brook, Salmons Brook and Pims Brook, which flow from west to east across Enfield. So the kind of northwest part of Enfield is very rural. It's green belt. Approximately 25-30% of the borough is nice open green space. The M25 is the northern boundary of Enfield. What this map is showing is where the flood risk is. So we've got these three rivers flowing across, and they all drain down towards the southeast corner of the borough, and that's where we've got a significant amount of flood risk. There's actually 2,000 or 3,000 properties that would be a risk of flooding there for an extreme event. So my job at leading the Watercourses Team is primarily about managing flood risk. We call it the Watercourses Team because we don't want it to be just about flood risk. We want to emphasise the fact that we're looking after Enfield's watercourses in general. So, you know, we're interested in the water quality, but also the habitat value and the actual quality of the rivers themselves and the water environment. But we're also interested in making spaces that people can enjoy and engage with nature. A lot of the rivers in Enfield, unfortunately, when Enfield was being urbanised roughly 100 years ago, rivers were treated pretty badly. They were buried underground in culverts, or they were channelized and hidden away or around the backs of people's houses. And wherever possible, we're trying to reverse that process. So, for example, this is one of the schemes we've done in Enfield over the last few years. This is Albany Park, which is also on the Turkey Brook. The photograph at the top right there is showing what it looked like before we started work. It ran along the north side of the park. It was in a 3.5 metre deep kind of concrete channel with lots of horrible bits of broken concrete and litter in it. That particular project was funded partly by the Environment Agency, Enfield Council, but also the Mayor of London contributed to it quite significantly as one of their Greener City grants. It was a £1.6 million project in total. What it looks like now is this. So we've actually brought the river into the park. It was a huge engineering project. We moved about 25,000 cubic meters of soil to make this happen, as well as moving the river into the park and making the slopes very, very nice and shallow so that people can walk right down to the water's edge. We also wanted to make spaces for nature. So although we've got outdoor classrooms and features that people can use, we've also tried to design the space so that there's lots of the river that isn't very accessible, so that there's places where nature can get some respite as well. We've also introduced wetlands within that site, alongside the river and on the other side of the park. So although it's still got lots of amenity features like moogers and a cafe and football pitches and so on, there's lots of really, really fantastic kind of nature spaces all around the park, really. So it completely transforms the experience of going there, whereas before you had river and a concrete channel and just acres and acres and acres of flat grass. And this project is quite typical of many other projects we've done across the borough over the last 10 years. So, like I say, river restoration, but a lot of them are what we would call sustainable drainage or constructive wetlands projects. So while we've been doing these, we've been thinking, well, this is an awful lot of trouble, getting all these diggers in and getting planning permission and getting huge amounts of funding to create wetlands. Maybe there's another way we could do it. And taking inspiration from the Beaver reintroduction projects across the country, we started to go and visit some other projects. So back in 2019, we went to visit Devon. We spoke to Mark Elliott from the Devon Wildlife Trust, who was really, really helpful and took us on a tour of their site. Not on the River Otter, but this was a site just off Dartmoor. And the reason he took us there was because at the time we were just starting to explore opportunities for natural flood management in Enfield. And we were interested in the ways that the beavers potentially could help us transform a site and restore the kind of hydrological, riverine features and so on. So Mark took us to this site, which is in an enclosure. And actually the stream that feeds into it, that comes off Dartmoor, is at the time that we went, it was barely a trickle of water. It was it hadn't rained for a couple of weeks, and it's quite a flashy catchment, quite thin soils and so on. So basically, there was very little water coming in. But what we observed was, as the water passed through this whole series of wetlands that the beavers had created, and bear in mind the beavers had been at this site for 9 or 10 years already at this time, the outflow from the site was actually, you know, significantly higher flow rate than what was coming in. And that's simply a reflection of how the beavers have captured the water, you know, brought the water table nearer to the surface, and actually restored the base flow of the river. So this is really inspiring for us, because this is exactly the sort of thing we want to achieve: reduce the peak flows and, you know, restore the base flow. And that's going to have, and also clean the water as well. And what was also really fascinating about it was just the incredible complexity of the environment the beavers had created there. So what you can probably tell from that photo is that there's not that many trees still standing. The beavers, like I said, they'd had quite a few years to do work in this area. The landowner we spoke to said that prior to the beavers' introduction, it was quite a dense woodland. But when you go there now, it's much more open. There's still a lot of trees, but it's got a much more open structure, and just a much wider variety of different spaces than you would have seen otherwise. What's also good about that project is that Devon Wildlife Trust, working with Exeter University, have done a lot of research in terms of impact on, you know, the hydraulics, the actual how it captures and attenuates water, but also about the quality. But what I really liked was the maps they'd made, really, really detailed maps, which they did progressively over a series of years, which really show how the site evolved as the beavers built increasing numbers of dams, but also each dam kind of like increased in width across the valley over time. So it was a really good story of how the beavers had impacted that space. So armed with this information, we came back to Enfield, and we were immediately thinking, where in Enfield can we introduce some beavers? And our first thought was, well, we can't really do it in a park, because our initial conversations with Natural England, and from seeing the site in Devon and some other sites that we went to visit, the one in Spain's Hall in Essex as well, we were basically got a clear steer that we wouldn't be able to have public access within the site. So we thought, well, we can't really have it in a park, which is obviously different to Ealing, for example. But at the time, we're thinking we can't have it in a park because we can't fence off a huge area of a park and suddenly announce that it's not publicly accessible anymore. So our first thought was to work with some of the tenant farmers. Now, what's interesting about the Greenbelt in Enfield is that it's virtually all owned by Enfield Council. And that's been the case since the late 60s, when the council was created and the council inherited that land from the GLC. We've got about a dozen different tenant farmers that we work with, but essentially Enfield is the landlord and freeholder for all of that land. So we went out to talk to some of our farmers, and we struck gold really with 40 Hall Farm. So this farm is really well run farm. It's very kind of like public facing already, because it's run by Capel Manor College, which is London's largest environmental college. They have several hundred students that come through there. So they use the farm as a kind of as a working farm, but also as an educational space. And within the farm estate, they had an area of woodland, which is just up the top there, Archer's Wood, which was woodland. It wasn't really part of the farm, but it was a wet woodland. And they actually contacted us initially to say, would we be interested in looking at changing the kind of like flow characteristics of that site, enhancing some of its wet woodland features, that kind of thing. And we said, well, actually, we're really interested in reintroducing beavers somewhere. And they immediately, Angelica Houses was the farm manager at the time. She's now actually got a job with the Wildlife Trust nationally, looking at doing beaver reintroductions elsewhere in the country. So she was very, very keen advocate for beavers right from the get-go. So we immediately decided that this would be a good site to do it. We contacted Derek Gow and the Beaver Trust and started progressing that and talking to Natural England about what we would need to do to get a license in place. And just have a look at the site. This is kind of what it looked like before we started doing anything. So it was fairly densely wooded, but there was a bit of open canopy as well. And as you can see from the sort of ground cover, sort of lots of sedges and rushes and things. So there was nowhere within that area that was completely covered in water, but it was damp, and there was a small stream running through it. And we monitored that stream. We were confident that it had a good base flow and that it would be a really good habitat to introduce beavers in. So over well, when was that? 2019, 2020. So I guess it took us a good sort of 18 months or so to go from making that decision initially to actually releasing the beavers. And actually, when we did get to the day when we released beavers into that site, which was in March 2022, there was a little bit of political pressure behind that. I think what was quite interesting was probably around 3 or 4 months before that, we'd started talking to cabinet members at the council about this proposal. And one of them in particular, who was the deputy leader at the time, Councillor Ian Barnes, really thought this was a brilliant idea and really wanted to see it happen. But he really wanted to see it happen before the local elections that were taking place that year. So we suddenly had a deadline, which is a bit frustrating sometimes when you've got this kind of artificial kind of politically imposed deadline. But actually my feeling was, well, let's go with it. You know, we've got this driver now, we've got political support, let's make the most of it, you know. And if we don't achieve that deadline, it's possible that, who knows, the funding or the impetus or the drivers might fall away. So let's just, that's my attitude to a lot of these projects, to be honest, is get on with it and do it, you know, with obviously putting the appropriate precautions and so on in place. But yeah, so the beavers, we had a pair of beavers who'd come from different sites initially. So one had come from Scotland, and this is the male beaver here, who'd come from another beaver enclosure in Yorkshire. And he was quite young, so they were released. Unfortunately, that first year was actually incredibly challenging for a couple of different reasons. One was it was incredibly dry. So up until virtually the week the beavers were released, it felt like we'd had non-stop rain for several weeks, and the site was incredibly wet. And as I say, we'd been monitoring this site for a couple of years, and we were confident that it always, it was a very wet site and there was an adequate amount of water. What happened after March was we had almost no rain for several months. And you might remember in 2022, there was quite a significant drought across the country. And our beaver site started to dry up. So this photo was taken at the pond that we created. So we created a pond initially for the beavers to make sure they had a nice pond with a pool of water that was at least 1 metre deep, which is important for the beavers' welfare, to just ensure they can kind of, obviously we're relying on the beavers to create their own habitat to a certain extent by damming and so on. But when we first release them, we want to make sure they've got some water habitat that's suitable for them to, for their kind of daily needs. Unfortunately, this, by June 2022, this was almost the only water we had left in the site. And we were getting quite worried about that sort of lack of water availability. We were fortunate in the sense that at the southern end, or the downstream end of the site, there was another stream that was running across the site. So we actually, to kind of try and address this issue, we actually dammed that stream, diverted it into the beaver site to give them another source of water. But that was challenging. So I guess my kind of lessons learned from that aspect of it was, even if you think you've got plenty of water, you might not have enough. And you might, just do more monitoring and more having a better understanding of the sort of hydrology of the catchment and the low flows and the risk of dry, droughts having an impact on the beavers is important. What I would say now is the beavers have transformed the site. They've got a huge volume of water stored within that site. So actually, if we had another drought like the one we had in 2022, we wouldn't have a problem, because it would take so long for that water to evaporate. We could manage without rain for many weeks before we'd have a problem. So I guess it's more of a kind of a problem in the early stages of a project. The other problem we had was that we actually had quite a lot of aggression between the two beavers that we'd introduced. So the female beaver, what we observed initially was, I think the male beaver was, basically the male beaver was, I think we had some evidence there'd been some, a bit of fighting going on, but that's something that's not unusual, was what we were, aware of. Beavers, when they first meet, often necessarily won't get on with each other straight away. But unfortunately, that kind of escalated and led to the male beaver dying because of, we had a post-mortem done by the Royal Vet College, they concluded that the cause of death was sort of weight loss induced by stress. But essentially, it boiled down to, the two beavers not getting on very well with each other. So that was quite, that was a big knockback, obviously, for the project. and then we were concerned about what could we do to manage this better, what would it mean for the future of the project, and so on. Eventually, what happened later that year was the female beaver was removed. She was on her own for quite a long time. She was then removed and taken to a different beaver enclosure up in Nottinghamshire in the Idle Valley, which is a much larger site. I think it's about 150 hectares, and it's actually almost all wetland. So she had lots and lots of space there. There were other beavers living there, but there'd be less kind of territorial pressure and less reason for them to get into fights, let's say. So what we then did, and this was all through working with the Beaver Trust and Derek Gow at the time, was we actually introduced a bonded pair of beavers who'd come down from Scotland, and they'd been trapped in the Tay Valley, partly because a farmer there was complaining that they were interfering with his potatoes, and he wanted to get a license from Nature Scott to shoot them, and Nature Scott said, well, don't do that, because the Beaver Trust have got a site down in Enfield that would love to have a pair of happy beavers. So they were brought down in December 2022, and it was fantastic as soon as they got onto the site, because immediately we were getting video footage of them, kind of almost like looking after each other, playing together, hanging out happily. So for us, that was really fantastic. After several months of like fraught anxiety about the lack of water and one solitary beaver living on her own and so on, and wondering what was going to happen in the future. And that positive introduction was rewarded last year when they produced a kit in that first summer, and that was just a solitary baby beaver initially, and that was received really well by everyone involved in the project. From a media perspective, it got a huge amount of attention as well. I think we had, as soon as we kind of announced that last year, we had BBC Breakfast News and all sorts of different media organisations wanting to get in on the act. Our press officer was quite frustrated, actually, because she said, she spends her whole life issuing press releases and not getting much, attention, and one mention of a baby beaver, and suddenly everyone wants to come down and film it. But anyway, so we've been monitoring that kit over the last few months, and that's still going really well. This year they had another 4 kits, so we've now, again, that's showing that they've obviously settled in very, very happily, and the adults are healthy, they're happy, etc. The youngsters are doing well, and we've now gone from just 2 beavers sort of a year and a half ago to 7 all of a sudden, and the license that we've got for that enclosure is 8. So we are now thinking, well, what are we going to do about the future? What are the future plans for the youngsters when they grow up, and so on. So before I get onto the future plans, this is a photo of what the site looks like now. So what you can see here is the kind of quite significant sized area of wetland they've created. This is just the downstream end of it. So it's probably about 50 or 60 meters wide, and it extends upstream for several hundred meters. So it covers probably just over a hectare in total. And they've created 2 lodges. So the one on the right is almost like that was the initial lodge they built. As they then successively dammed up the site and led to more water being stored, we think what happened was that lodge got kind of drowned out. They then built a larger lodge, which is the one in the foreground, which is set slightly higher. And then this summer, when the water level did drop a bit, not significantly, but it did drop a bit, it was almost like they returned back to the original lodge. So you could think of that as their sort of summer home. And then they seem to use both one. But the one in the foreground is much bigger and seems to be their main sort of habitat. So in terms of the future, we submitted a bid to the Mayor of London's Rewild London Fund early this year. And that was to increase the size of the enclosure. And also put in some additional monitoring equipment. One of the negative aspects of having to kind of not exactly rush, but kind of like fast track the initial element of the project was that we weren't doing as much monitoring as maybe we would have done. Like, we had cameras, but we weren't monitoring lots of data about flows and water quality and so on, in the same way that, for example, the project in Devon had done. So some of the funding that we've got this year is to enhance that monitoring aspect of it, working with Cape Manor College and some of the students there, who are a fantastic resource, and all through the project, they've been brilliant in terms of, monitoring the animals themselves, and now monitoring some other aspects of the site, and also working with Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust in terms of carrying out ecological, habitat monitoring. But also what we want to do is make the site a bit more accessible. I mean, when we chose this site initially, we kind of chose a site that was quite hard to get to on purpose. So it's near 40 Hall Park, which has got a car park, and you can park there, but it's about a 20-minute walk from the car park, and you have to walk along a muddy track, so it's not particularly easy to get to. Having said that, and we've never really signposted it, because again, when we first introduced these beavers, we weren't exactly sure what kind of reaction we were going to get from the public, and we were slightly concerned we might get sort of almost too many people trying to come and visit. But now we're confident that the beavers are established and they're kind of happy in their habitat and settled in nicely and so on. We're going to put in some access improvements and put in some wayfinding and some interpretation features. And we're also creating a viewing platform so that people can kind of see the site more easily, and understand and learn a bit more about what we're doing and so on. So in terms of what we're hoping to do in the longer term, in a way, this project forms part of our kind of wider kind of rewilding or landscape recovery project that we're doing across rural Enfield. And this is very much linked to, we call it the Enfield Chase Landscape Recovery Project, because there's a really big heritage angle to this whole project. If we go back several hundred years, that area that's kind of shown by the dashed line, which pretty much is the northwest third of Enfield, was all part of Enfield Chase Royal Hunting Forest. And over the years, bits of it were sold off. Some of it was turned into farmland, some of it was urbanized. And now there are just a few kind of isolated fragments of ancient woodland remaining. But what we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years, partly from a natural flood management point of view, but also for many, many other reasons. And one of the main drivers for this project is for us to be able to create more places, more kind of publicly accessible woodlands and wetlands and other types of nature habitats that people can visit and connect with nature. So it's not just for Enfield residents, it's for people who live anywhere in North London or outside London as well. Potter's Bar is just outside Enfield, and you've got Barnet and other places nearby as well. So we're kind of trying to go from a world where a lot of the green belt and the spaces in this part of Enfield look like this, kind of arable farming with some, pockets of woodland on the fringes, and a river. This is the Sammers Brook River, which currently looks a bit like this. I've used that photo because it kind of shows, when we talked to the farmer who manages that farm, he kind of said, "Oh, that's not a river. I thought it was just a ditch," and it's kind of that gives us an idea about how the custodians of the landscape currently think of these important natural features. And a few years ago, that farmer did actually just go along it with a big machine and a bucket and dredge it. And, that's basically how it's ended up in that state, is that it's been dredged and straightened and it doesn't act like a natural river anymore. And from a natural flood management point of view, that's incredibly important, because what it means is that a lot of that arable farmland has got land drainage and drainage ditches, and the river has been straightened and dredged and so on. So what it means is it's incredibly efficient at getting rid of water. And when you actually do the flood mapping for it, what it means is that you don't get there's very, very little flooding actually on the greenbelt. The flooding is all happening down in Edmonton. So the principle of natural flood management is to slow the flow down, hold more water in the greener rural parts, and thereby protect people from flooding downstream. That means you're going to get slightly less land for food production, but you're going to get all these amazing nature benefits associated with it as well. So the 3 key sort of aims of our developing natural flood management project are plant more trees, so create more woodland, create more of what we call rural suds, which is a slightly tongue-in-cheek term, but basically it means lots and lots of small ponds and wetlands dotted around the catchment to slow the flow, increase infiltration, and help to promote, bring the water table nearer to the surface, and also restore the base flow in the river. But the key one really is about river restoration. So putting the river more back to a natural state. And I've included this slide just because it kind of shows, I'm a hydrologist, so I have to include a hydrograph at some point, really, just to kind of show the incredible impact all of these measures are going to have on the river. So that top hydrograph is showing for a 5% annual event. That's a 1 in 20, you could call it. The red line is the base flow, so that's how it is currently. If we did the woodland, and that's 400 hectares of woodland across the catchment, it would reduce the peak flow in the river. But if we do the woodland, the river restoration and the rural soils, it takes it right down to that dark blue line, which is an incredible change in the rainfall runoff characteristics for the catchment, which for me as a hydrologist is very exciting, you know. So here's a picture of some of the woodlands we've been planting. That's one of the wetlands we've done, and then going back to that river. What we've been doing there is working with a company called Seebeck, who are geomorphologists, looking at how we can restore that river to a more natural state. I mean, actually, what's interesting at this point in the catchment, the river is quite shallow. Further downstream, it's a lot deeper and a lot wider. So typically, it might be sort of 3 or 4 meters deep in places and about 8 or 10 meters wide from bank to bank. Whereas when the geomorphologists have looked at the catchment and tried to kind of reverse calculate how big that river should be, they estimate that it should only really be about 0.5 meter deep and about 2 meters wide. So what we're going to be looking to do over the next year or two is restore that river using kind of mechanical means. So we're going to be reintroducing meanders and backwaters and other natural features. We're basically going to be looking to fill in the channel. And the way we're going to do that is with a lot of large woody debris. So when you're in the kind of river restoration world, you're talking about, you know, restoring these kind of riverine features, bringing in lots of wood, and people often call them beaver analogues. So you're thinking, oh, okay, beaver analogues, why don't we actually, you know, use beavers? So the problem we have with this particular river at the moment is that it's been so engineered over the years by the farmers that it actually goes dry every summer. So it's not really in the kind of state where we could introduce beavers right now. But what the strategy we're proposing is to use mechanical interventions to restore the river to a natural state. And then once we've got halfway there, introduce the beavers in, say, 3 or 4 years' time, and then allow the beavers to kind of really finish it off and take it more back to a much more natural habitat. So this project is all part of that kind of emerging vision for Enfield's Greenbelt land. It's about creating more publicly accessible areas, restoring rivers and wetlands, reintroducing species like beavers and grazing cattle and so on, but also making it accessible by having a network of footpaths. And this final slide is just to kind of convey that vision of all the different activities that we want to see happening in the Greenbelt. So there you go. I'll hopefully that's gives you a good picture of what we're doing in Enfield and what we might be doing in the future. Happy to answer any questions.
Great. Oh, thank you so much, Ian. That was incredibly informative. And thank you for being so open about, you know, the challenges you've had. But look at the amazing success with 4 new kits this year. Well, 7 beavers now is absolutely fantastic success, and I love your vision as well. So Ben, if we can stop the recording, that'd be fantastic, and then we'll sort of jump into questions.